Good afternoon. My name is Bethany Maddox, and I'm a member of the customer care team here at Vitech Corporation. I'm very pleased to be your host for this webinar today as we discuss leveraging service-oriented architectures with MBSE. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to review a few technical details. First, questions. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time via the Q&A function in the GoToWebinar window. We will be monitoring these throughout today's event. We plan to respond to all questions at the end of the webinar, so please send them in. The webinar is being recorded today. If you are having technical difficulties during the presentation, an online archive with this presentation will be available within 24 hours of the live version. I believe that takes care of all of our housekeeping matters, so let's get started. I'd like to take a moment to introduce Zane Scott, our speaker for today's presentation. Zane is the Vice President of Professional Services and Training Organization. For the past 30 years, Zane has built a skill set which enables him to provide insight and guidance to individuals and companies as they improve organizational processes and methodologies across their organizations. Zane is the author of numerous white papers, including 9 Laws of Effective Systems Engineering, and is co-author of Vitech's Primer for Model-Based Systems Engineering. Please join me in welcoming our speaker for today, Zane Scott.
Thanks, Bethany, and let's begin with a special thanks to Bethany in the studio and our engineer Eva Dace in the booth this afternoon. They make this all possible. Welcome to our webinar on leveraging service-oriented architectures, or what we call SOAs, with MBSE. I'd like to begin this afternoon with several disclaimers. Many times it's just as helpful to know what a program is not about as it is to understand what will be covered. This webinar is not about how to construct a SOA, nor is it about the benefits of having a SOA. Those topics are covered elsewhere and are pretty well known. But what we're seeking to do this afternoon is to talk about a missing piece in the construction of most SOAs. The critical aim of the service-oriented architecture, or SOA, is to bring services to the business enterprise. In the world of enterprise architecture, a service is defined as a unit of functionality, typically software functionality, but not necessarily so, that is packaged for convenient and consistent use. While this definition is accurate as far as it goes, it leaves unstated a concept which is implied but not often explicitly seen during the design of the SOA. Notice that the definition says that the unit of functionality is packaged for convenient and consistent use. What is left unstated here is use by who or what. Just as that who or what is not an explicit part of this definition, it can very easily not be an explicit part of the design. What we're going to do today is to over and over again make a very common sense and yet much ignored point about this who and what. The who and what, of course, are the business enterprise processes. The service cannot become a service without someone or something to be served. In order to understand how the service is to be used, we must first understand what it is to serve. In the case of the SOA, it is the business processes that are to be served. Gaining this understanding is a step that's very often ignored or given short shrift in the process of a SOA design. So to see how that happens, we'll begin our discussion with a general treatment of how the service-oriented architecture typically comes about. Most often the SOA construction becomes an IT project. It typically arises from the need that is felt in the enterprise governance structure for the advantages of economies of scale and efficiencies in the delivery of IT services. In response to these needs, the IT department is approached concerning the improvement of service delivery and/or the standardization of the services that are offered across the enterprise. The IT department is presented with the challenge of how to make the gains from efficiencies and economies of scale. That challenge is almost always answered beginning with a consideration of the services that IT already has at hand. The IT department typically begins the process with an inventory of the services already being offered to the enterprise. The task here is to look at the individual services and garner a solid definition of what's being offered. The assumption underlying this process is that IT is currently offering the services necessary to the business enterprise, and that it's therefore logical to offer through the new service-oriented architecture a set of services with the same functionality that's currently present across the system. The IT department is cognizant of the opportunity to deduplicate and improve on the functionality being offered to the enterprise. In that vein, the functionality of each of the existing services is examined and compared to the functionality residing in other services present in the system or available to them. From there, it is possible for IT to make decisions about which services, and therefore what functionality, will continue into the new architecture or be procured or developed to supplement what is already at hand. The result is the most efficient offering of the current service functionality that IT can provide, with such improvements in the functionality as can be made within the scope of the project commission, particularly with due consideration to the project budget. Once the decisions on the services have been made, they're then connected to an enterprise service bus for offering to the enterprise business processes. Having given due consideration to how to most efficiently and economically provide the functionality in the current system, the IT designers task the enterprise service bus to make that functionality readily and consistently available to the enterprise. When this step is complete, the services to be provided are offered to the enterprise through a standard connection. While the benefits of a service-oriented architecture go beyond the economies of scale and efficiencies of provision, this is most often the desired to-be state of a basic SOA. There is, however, a rather large problem remaining, and this problem is very often left unsolved by the SOA. The problem that we're considering here is one of the opportunity lost in the architecture design process. It has to do with the fact that the architecture design has turned on the assumption that the functionality currently being offered to the enterprise through the IT system represents the sum and substance of the functionality needed by the business enterprise. Now, that might be essentially true in some cases, but unless we engage in a detailed examination of the business processes themselves, we can't know how large an opportunity to serve those processes we might be missing. To this point, the enterprise business processes have been treated as a black box, and their needs have been inferred from the services currently being offered. But the less we know about the contents of that box, the less the chance that the services offered are going to meet the needs of the business processes it represents. The inference that existing services will suffice can cause us to lose focus on the basic meaning of a service. A well-designed set of functionality needs something more than efficient and uniform packaging in order to become a service. That functionality is only a service insofar as it actually serves a process. Unless it serves, it can't be a service. The concept that's lost here is exactly that. A service must serve a process. To the extent that it does not, it is a set of functionality that defies its own label. To the extent that it provides functionality that is not needed by the business enterprise processes, or fails to provide functionality that is needed by those processes, it is not truly a service. The implication of this concept is that we can be sure that we are providing the right set of functionality to make up the needed services only after we understand the business processes that they'll serve. Each process requires functionality in order to accomplish its purposes. To truly understand what functionality is required by a process, we should begin not with the functionality currently being provided to the process, but with an understanding or a map of that process that can show us the functionality that it requires. If we fail to come to that understanding, there are a number of consequences that may arise. To the extent that our failure to understand the processes causes us not to deliver the needed functionality, the processes may fail, or at least fail to operate as efficiently as they might. In other words, the wheels may begin to come off the business enterprise processes. Another very interesting and counterproductive consequence is what I like to call guerrilla IT. Business processes that are faced with a real or even a perceived deficit in service functionality coming from the new architecture will defensively attempt to find that functionality elsewhere. This often becomes an effort to procure or develop functionality in a one-off attempt to fill the gap. I've even seen business process owners approach customers to raise funds with which to develop the functionality needed to serve those customers because they feel that they lack that functionality as a result of the new SOA. Needless to say, this runs counter to the whole idea of the purposes of a service-oriented architecture. Certainly nothing in the development of the service-oriented architecture should act to encourage the piecemeal development of service functionality. If we wish to avoid the subpar performance or failure of the business enterprise processes due to the inadequacy of the new SOA and/or the inefficiencies involved in individual processes seeking one-off solutions for missing functionality, then we have to get a handle on the shape and the content of the business process layer. This means that we have to come up with a map of that layer, and that map has to become the starting point for the SOA. That means that the construction of a service-oriented architecture should begin with a detailed mapping of the business process layer. This is where model-based systems engineering can begin to offer a lever for the architecture development. Using a solid middle-out modeling approach accompanied by a powerful modeling tool, it is possible to develop an executable model of the process architecture. This architecture offers the key to understanding the enterprise business services layer. It should be noted at this point that business process improvement on whatever scale is appropriate becomes the low-hanging fruit in the presence of such a model. While we won't go into the details of how to approach making a middle-out model of business processes using process owner interviews, suffice it to say that we have never undertaken such a model without at least some improvement of the process arising from the process owners themselves as they examine their own business processes. Actually, the iterative interview technique for constructing this middle-out model has already been the subject of a webinar, which is posted on our website for on-demand viewing if you are interested in more details on that process. By using a modeling tool capable of outputting a variety of representations in various formats, business process owners are able to see the improvement opportunities and to easily refine the map of their processes until the map fits their process accurately. Such a tool can not only produce the technical views needed by the designers of the SOA, but the process views that are understandable for process owners. Once we've captured the process maps, including any improvements that are to be made prior to the construction of the SOA, we can begin to derive from the process model the requirements for service functionality. By looking at the business processes, it becomes readily apparent what functionality is necessary to promote the efficient and effective delivery of those processes. This can be compiled into a set of requirements which then become the basis on which the SOA can be constructed. Now, instead of a mere inference of the required service functionality based on the current service functionality, the architecture can use a model of the process layer from which to derive the requirements for the service functionality. These requirements create a picture of the service functionality that will be required to truly serve the business processes. It is against this picture that we can begin to compare existing and proposed services for the new service layer. This picture is based on those requirements, and those requirements flow from an actual model of the processes. So the picture of the services that are required is accurate to the extent that we've made an accurate model of the processes and therefore have a good, solid, verifiable derivation of the requirements for functionality that flows from them. Now, this is done by comparing the existing services to the requirement set and determining what set of services best fulfills those requirements. See how we're running in the opposite direction here? Instead of looking at the existing services and inferring what the service requirements are from what we are currently offering, we're looking at the actual requirements, and from that we are deriving the nature of the functionality that's needed. In this process, it'll become apparent where there are existing services that might be set aside or combined with other services. Where there are gaps in the existing services, that too will emerge. These gaps in functionality can be closed by services that can be procured or developed specifically for that purpose, with the gap in mind. Added to the existing services being retained, these new services will complete the service layer to be offered through the business enterprise service bus. It's important to note that the standard for all of these choices, procurement and development, are the requirements derived from the model of the enterprise business process layer. These requirements now drive the construction of the SOA. Just as in the traditional process, the services chosen or developed for the service layer are offered back to the business process layer through the enterprise service bus. The difference in this case is that we now have a high degree of confidence that's made possible because the requirements development flowing from the middle-out model of the process layer has allowed us to make a good solid derivation. The middle-out modeling process and the strength of the modeling tool used to drive the quality of the model, and therefore the quality of the requirements, are the strength of this new way of approaching the design. We've done a number of these middle-out process models and have found that it's relatively easy to rapidly obtain a highly accurate process model. Even the most reluctant process owner quickly becomes a fan of the model. and they almost always develop a sense of ownership in the model. This becomes particularly important when they suggest changes or agree to process changes that increase effectiveness and efficiency, because not only do they own the as-is model, but they own the to-be model as well from a psychological standpoint. So this makes the model ring through into the area of change management and reduces or completely eliminates the need for a back-end sales job. As I said earlier, we discussed those advantages as we discussed the iterative interview process and what it has to offer in the previous webinar. So the change management processes are much smoother, and the connection of the SOA to the process owner's process models makes for a much easier acceptance curve when the SOA is rolled out. There's no guerrilla IT involved here. With the graphics capability in a tool like Vitex Core, it's possible to construct the process models almost in real time with the interviews. Even before those graphics capabilities were available, we were always able to produce the model iterations more quickly than the process owners could schedule the time to examine and correct them with us. Designing the SOA using this middle-out modeling technique would not substantially delay the project, and it would result in significant gains in the quality of the solution, even if the model was constrained to the as-is processes without any improvements. The opportunity for process improvement along the way simply represents an often significant bonus from this approach. But of course, the greatest benefit comes from a service-oriented architecture where the service functionality answers the real and present needs of the enterprise business processes without misfits or disconnects. Using these tools and methods from model-based systems engineering provides a powerful lever to the service-oriented architecture design process. So you can see what we've done by adding this as an aspect of the SOA design is that we have turned the SOA design around so that it flows from requirements to functionality to architecture, instead of beginning with the assumption that the functionality present in the current IT architecture constitutes everything that's needed. So we've kind of turned this inside out to get it into the right order. And this is only possible because we use the principles of model-based systems engineering to approach this particular problem. I think that introducing this step is a great opportunity to improve the quality of the resulting service-oriented architecture without adding a great deal of cost to the project, either in terms of effort or time. So it's a way that we can, for very little on the cost side, add a great deal to the benefits side of the ledger. I'd be more than happy to take questions.
Thank you, Zane. We are ready to move on to questions for you. We've received a few really good questions, and thanks to those who have submitted. I encourage everyone to join the discussion by submitting the question via the Q&A function in the GoToWebinar window. So let's get started. Our first question is from Jarrett, and he asks, doesn't it take a long time to get the process owner information about their processes?
Jarrett, that's really surprising, actually. When we first began to do these middle-out models, we were doing them not particularly for SOAs, but for process improvement efforts. And we would sit down with process owners and start talking to them using an iterative interview technique about their processes. And we came up with a methodology, which was the subject of our last webinar, that was a very efficient way of going about it. So we were able to quickly get a very, very accurate picture of the processes. Now, one of the things that was a surprise was how quickly process owners warmed up to it, even where they were reluctant to begin with. Once they got in and saw that what we really wanted to know was what they had to say about their processes, they were very accepting of the approach, and that added to the efficiency and cut down on the amount of time that we had to spend with them. Very often, and if anyone who's worked in the process improvement area knows that one of the traps or pitfalls of that arena is that you go in and look at a process. If you do that and then come back and say, here are the suggestions, almost always the process owners read that as a consultant coming in and saying, look, if you were as smart as I am, this is the way you would do the process. And needless to say, that doesn't sell very well. But where we were involving the process owners and eliciting from them not only the nature of their current processes, but their improvements.
I'm always leery of someone who says, Jim, I'm calling you today to create a partnership with you, which I know immediately what that means.
Right.
They're what they can get from the partnership. I have a tendency to try my best to give first to people like this. And if I'm going to start a partnership, I start off with giving, and then seeing what's in it for me later on. Now, as a change agent, what's the number one job of a change agent? You mentioned, yeah.
I mentioned what? I didn't quite get the last of what you said there.
Zane, this is Bethany. I think we may have lost Jim's audio there.
What Jim is saying is well taken. You know, you come in as a change agent, and you always have to look out for the portrayal that people read into that, which is, I've come to bring light unto the darkness, and I'm the light and you're the darkness. And the more you can stay away from that, the better off you are, of course, as a change agent.
Thanks, Zane. Earlier, you got into a little bit of a question that came in from Warren, and I want to call out and note that he noted that you did give a webinar in October on iterative interviews, and Warren did specifically ask if that technique can be used to derive SOA requirements. And I think you kind of went there with the answer to Jarrett, asking about getting process owner information back to them about their processes.
Sure, that's the very technique that you would use in any kind of a middle-out modeling. Anytime you're going to go in and model an existing process, that iterative interview, and by iterative, what we mean is that we go in and we conduct a structured interview with the process owners about their process, go back and construct a model of our understanding of what we've said, and then we come back to them and say, look, based on our discussions yesterday or last week or whenever it was, here's a picture. And most times with business process folks, we used enhanced functional flow block diagrams to show them they understand those, they intuitively see those coming from a world that uses flow charts. We would show them an EFFBD of the process and say, is this your process? And the typical reaction was, Well, yeah, almost, but I do this differently or I do that differently. And so we would mark up our representation of the process model with their comments. And this is the point where they would start making improvements. You'd find them saying, you know, I do that this way, but now that I see it all laid out like this, maybe I should do that just here and not in 2 or 3 different places. So that's where they begin to mark it up and improve it. But we would then take it back and correct the model to reflect their comments. And we would iterate through that until the time that we took it, laid it out, and they looked at it and said, yeah, that's me. That's my process. That's what we do. And then you knew you were done, and you knew it was accurate, and you knew you're ready in the case of a SOA to start doing the requirements derivation for the SOA requirements. That typically, I've never seen that take, even in a very complex process, I've never seen that take more than 3 rounds to get to that. It's usually a pretty quick process. And but yes, that's exactly the technique that you would use to model any kind of an existing process.
Thanks, Zane. Billy asks if guerrilla IT really does happen.
Yeah, it does happen. We actually the instance that I cited in there is actually ripped from the headline, so to speak. There was an IT project in this organization which went around and looked at certain IT functionality that all of the departments in the organization were using. And then IT went back and said, okay, this particular program is better than that program to fulfill this functionality. So we're going to decree basically that all departments will use this functionality, use this particular program. We're not going to support the other programs anymore. And so they published it and discontinued their support. Well, this one particular department had some needs that they felt like required another program's particular set of functionality. And they first started with disagreeing with IT. And then they basically said, okay, well, forget you. And they went to the customer and said, look, in order to provide you what you need, we're going to have to develop an application. Do you have any money that we could spend to go and do that application? So the customer ponied up the money. They did a development process and developed the app to suit their needs and ran it in a one-off off of the IT baseline. So yes, it's alive and well and living around anywhere there's a disgruntled functionality customer.
Wow, Zane, that's almost kind of shocking when you think about how organizations are constantly talking about communication and making sure that we're working together. I guess it really does open our eyes that these things really happen out there.
Well, it's exactly counter to what you're trying to do with a SOA, because
Mm-hmm.
with a SOA you're trying to say, okay, let's benefit from economies of scale and efficiencies of delivery and standardization. And so if you do things that encourage people to go out there and engage in one-off solutions, you're defeating your own purpose.
Thank you. Grant asks if you know of any firms that had applied this approach to inventory and logistics of materials, such as within a manufacturing environment.
I have not personally seen that applied in that way, but our iterative interview technique came from concepts from Lean Six Sigma. In other words, we used a SIPOC, a supplier inputs, process, outputs, customers format for the interviews. And so it very much looks like Lean Six Sigma, and you know, that kind of a technique, of course, has been applied widely in industry and manufacturing and in inventory and supply. But what we found was that it worked no matter what the process was, whether it was heavily a human process from, you know, conducting an accounting or financial analysis operation to to a software-driven human oversight kind of an operation. It worked in all cases. But this is drawn right out of concepts that come from the manufacturing world. So I would think that its applicability would be seamless.
Great. And from Kent, we have a question. Are services analogous to components? And how do you recommend that they be distinguished when modeling in a tool such as Core?
I have to think about that, see if there's any Kent traps in that question. Actually, I don't think that services would directly correspond to components, because services are a set of functionality. So really, the functionality resides in the behavioral domain. Now, the behavior, the functionality in that package could be allocated to a component or components, but I don't think that they would be exactly the same. So if you were modeling them in Core, you would model the functionality in the behavior-oriented realm and then allocate it to the physical or component realm.
Thanks for that clarification. Our next question is from Mac. And Mac says, as SOAs evolve and services are added or deleted, can the model be used to predict performance and develop requirements for changes to the architecture?
Well, one of the coolest things about doing an as-is or existing process architecture model is that once you have that model, then the evolution, change, reorganization all gets expressed as changes to the model. So we encourage clients when we were doing these kinds of models to keep the model in front of them and to keep it updated. So as you made process changes in response to changing requirements for the organization, for example, you would make changes in that model. So once you've gone through the initial modeling practice, yes, that really should become a living, I hesitate to say a living document because it's not a document, but the model should become a living thing which should reflect current reality. And it's even easier to update than it was to construct.
Okay, and a follow-up from Mac is, can this be applied to developing cloud solutions?
I would certainly think so. I have not seen that done, but cloud functions are it's all about functionality. So you're modeling the functionality, and here let me put in a plug. There are lots of people in the world who say, I want to take requirements and allocate them to components. And they want to skip functionality, skip behavior, and simply allocate requirements as if components fulfill requirements. But it's very important not to use that shorthand. It's important to recognize that components provide functionality, and it's the functionality or behavior which satisfies the requirement. A component doesn't satisfy a requirement. It produces functionality which can satisfy the requirement. So in that sense, that goes on in the cloud as well. So wherever you have a process, it rides on the functionality, and you could model it and use these techniques in that setting.
Great, thank you. That wraps up the Q&A for today. If we weren't able to answer your question during the Q&A portion of the presentation, we will contact you directly after the webinar to ensure that your question is answered. We will also post all questions with answers at community.vitechcorp.com in the general discussion forum. If you have other questions or comments you didn't send in today, we do invite you to post those questions on our community site as well. A recording of today's webinar will be posted to our website, vitechcorp.com, by the close of business tomorrow. In closing, I'd like to thank our presenter today. I'd especially like to thank all of you for joining us as we wrap up our fall webinar series. As we bring this webinar to a close, a survey will open on your screen, either in a new browser tab or in a new window. Please take a moment to provide us with feedback on today's presentation and on what topics you'd like to see covered in future webinars. Thank you for joining us and have a great day.